Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining me on another on this day in Canadian military history live stream, another book live stream. I really enjoy these ones. I think they're really good information and good discussions about the various topics. So I hope you'll enjoy this one. I'm excited for this one. It's a book I've known about for a while, but haven't been able to get to it because I've been so busy. But I have been wanting to read it, so I finally got to do that. So tonight I got Alex Souchen on with me talking about his book War Junk. So we're going to learn quite a bit about disposal policy. I know it sounds boring, but it's really not. There's some really interesting stories behind some of the stuff with disposal and resale and all that stuff. There's a lot of good stuff here. So Alex, thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure to have you on here. Like I was just saying, your book is different in a good way. I mean, I like to have a little different stuff on the channel every now and again, and this is a bit of a different one, right? I mean, I don't have to tell you that this subject is hardly known. I mean, you hear stories every now and again about stuff showing up. I think a couple of weeks ago, I saw a story about the area I used to live in. A grenade showed up somewhere, and people were playing with it, and it's a bit harrowing when people do that, and quite frankly, kind of dumb. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, so this topic, the book, I really did enjoy reading your book.
Oh, thank you.
It was great. The writing was excellent, and just the scope of this stuff. I'm probably not doing a great job explaining it, so that's what you're here for. But I did want to start off.
Sure.
Like I said, this is a bit of a different topic. You don't hear too much about it. You hear, dribs and drabs and pieces and stories from people that lived through the time period or just after. I was wondering how you came to choose this topic and kind of what led you here.
You know what? I came to this topic in all honesty by accident. Really, really and truly. At the start of my PhD way back in 2010, I had gone into the PhD thinking I was going to look at veterans rehabilitation in Canada after the Second World War. So I spent my master's work on the Battle of Normandy, looking at like combat and morale. And the questions about like how people recover from that experience was always something that like lingered with me. And it was something that my advisor, Serge Derflinger, really suggested that I look at more thoroughly. So I showed up at Western, working with Jonathan Vance to study veterans. And then I went into comps and comprehensive exams. And as I'm sure that you know, that's quite an experience, reading like 200 books in less than 200 days and other things like that. I'm sure you know the drill.
Oh, yeah.
And my two sort of minor fields were in material culture and public history. And then the other one was in American history. And so the two professors that I was learning from, one had a real interest in technology, and then the other one had a sort of real experience in material culture. So Michelle Hamilton was a public historian, and Rob McDougall was the Americanist that I was working with. And those two really like opened my eyes to objects. And so I started like asking the same sort of questions that I've been asking about veterans. I started asking about objects, and it kind of dawned on me. I'm like, what did they do with all the guns when they didn't need them anymore? Right. That was the first sort of question I asked myself. I was like, what about all those like beds that they slept on, like at training bases? Like, right. Like what did the buildings, where did they go? Like what is the sort of material story to this transition? And so the more I started like going down that rabbit hole, the more questions I started asking. And I was like, holy moly, like I can't find anything written that answers that question. And so after I was done comps, I did my proposal and whatnot. I just kind of like walked into my advisor's office, and I was like, Dr. Vance, I think I'm going to change my subject from veterans rehabilitation to war garbage. And the look on his face was priceless. He just kind of like raised an eyebrow, looked at me. He's like thinking about it really carefully. And he's like, why don't you write something down and then come back and talk to me, right? And so that's where it kind of came from. And I think, as I said in the acknowledgments of the book, I think the topic is just weird enough that it piqued his interest. And that's essentially how I came to it. And once I started looking into it, I never ever looked back. I mean, looking at the material culture and the transitions between, utility and value regimes and the sort of stuff that
Right.
gets used up rather than the stuff that ends up in museums. That was really something that I thought needed to be said.
Yeah, I mean, it's that comes through, right? And like you said in your acknowledgments, you talk about, you literally said that, like how he's kind of shocked. And I went to Western myself, so I know all these people you're talking about. Rob McDougall was my supervisor for my MA, and I worked
Oh, okay.
with Dr. Vance quite a bit. So yeah, it's so funny to hear these stories, right, from people that I know or was educated with by myself. But anyway, so I can imagine him making that face. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
so you did the opposite of me. I was at U of
yeah,
O and then went to Western. You went the other
yeah,
way.
we switched places
Yeah.
several years apart,
Yeah.
but yeah, so it's an interesting topic because again, yeah, it doesn't really get talked about too much. I mean, there's this kind of there's elements like I said, like you hear about, but there's also pop cultural elements, which I think pretty much in any subject when it comes to military history has an undeniable power on how we view these things. Like American
Mhm.
involvement in Vietnam, I think a lot of people watched right these videos of them, throwing helicopters off aircraft carriers. And then there's movies like Best Years of Our Lives, right? Like that's a
Mhm.
famous scene in movie history, let alone military or war movies, right? Of all the leftover planes and
Yeah.
everything, right? Again, I don't have to tell you that, but for people who might not know, it's a good movie as well. You should check it out. But it's just kind of puts in your mind's eye of there's so much stuff, and that's a huge part of the Allied war effort too, right? Is as you talk about with the Canadian government's policies, but it's the Allied policy, right? We'll just yeah, they can hold the land as long as they want, and call themselves whatever they like, elite units, whatever. We're just gonna basically outspend you, and
Mhm.
there's nothing you can do about it. But then again, and again, I'll let you. I want to talk about kind of how these policies develop because I think it's a really interesting way. I mean, how this comes about,
Mhm.
particularly in Canada. But again, it's kind of like a problem that, and it is a problem at first, right? As you frame it,
Yeah.
that kind of does sneak up on the government a little bit, but I think they kind of get the ground under them. But again, there's problems throughout. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the Canadian war effort or any war effort for that matter.
Yeah.
But just if you could just kind of explain a little bit about kind of what that looked like, right? Because you start talking about a little bit about like what was done after the First World War
Mhm.
and how that was not well handled,
Yeah.
and kind of what that meant for the next war. Because again, like I always say, I think I say this on pretty much anytime this comes up, World War II in Canada cannot be understood without understanding the First World War context.
Yeah.
So sorry not to talk over your points, but I
No,
just think
no, no, no. That's a valid point
it's
because
something I harp. Yeah.
having a second world war presupposes the existence of a first world
Right.
war, right? And so there's always that reflective nature in the policies that you see in the Second World War.
Mm.
How did we do this before? Oh yeah, we didn't do it very well here, here, and here. Okay, well, what do we need to change, right? So there's a lot of like guiding experiences that the First World War provided. And you see that a lot in the Second World War paperwork. And so, First World War historians, I've often told, it's like, listen, some of the answers to your questions might be solved looking at Second World War records because they talk about that kind of stuff and the sort of synopsis of the sort of like legacies of certain policies and stuff. And in regards to disposal, it's a big concern. So at the end of the First World War, like the abrupt end and
Mm.
surrender, it caught everybody off guard, and no one had really been thinking about like how are we going to get rid of things. And so there's a lot of like ad hoc policies that came into play. I mean, we didn't know if the Treaty of Versailles would be successfully negotiated or anything. So there's like a delay in disposal as well. Towards the end of, I believe it's like 1920,
Mm.
1919, they start to dispose of stuff
Right.
actually. And so what you see happening is the government doesn't really think about the long-term ramifications of flooding supply.
Mm.
So what they started doing was like, oh yeah, we have all this brass that we've been acquiring to build artillery shells for the war effort, and now we get rid of it, and it overwhelms the brass market. And in the process, what happens is a twofold situation where the price of brass drops because you're looking at a lot of oversupply, which affects the primary producers, right? Quite badly. Their profits are going to be undermined. And then you're also looking at like the secondary manufacturers, the people that those primary manufacturers usually sell their product to. They instead will go to the government inventory and kind of like cut out the primary producers. So this idea of like trying to create a sustainable growth that you get following the Second World War, it doesn't happen because these sort of illegitimate supply chains happen. When the government sells to a speculator, the speculator sells to another speculator, the third speculator finally sells it to the secondary purchaser. And by the time that happens, the primary producer's out of jobs, right? And so you're looking at this like huge speculative market that follows the depression that hits the economy into 1920, 21. There's a bad recession that hits the Western world around there, and it undermines everything. And so when it came time to planning disposal in 1943, 44, when they started to really think about like, okay, how are we going to unmake what we've just made? Their concerns came from that fear because, looking back at the end of World War I, those politicians and those bureaucrats, they were looking at it through the lens of the 1930s, and it had like shrouded everything in failure. And they were very, very concerned about just creating disposal policies that didn't work, that would replicate and create a second Great Depression that would be even worse than the one before. So they said, okay, we need to figure out what they did wrong and then do the exact opposite. And it became a process of like trying to make a really stringent and restrictive disposal system. And then that didn't really work. And they had to adapt it on the fly to accommodate, just a massive influx of items that needed to be disposed of. And then they really, really had to rely on established businesses. So they had to bring businesses into the equation. And so the big part about the sort of, let's say, the contemporary lesson for, if you're reading the book right now, would be about establishing a system of reverse logistics where the government gets the businesses on board to buy back their equipment. And so once they do that, like Ford and GM and all the other companies that had just produced the stuff for the war effort, they buy a lot of it back, recondition it, and then sell it as civilian products for domestic markets, or even as for foreign markets as well. And so they really get business on board. They pay a lot of attention to what the sort of status quo was and what business needs were. And then they also decided that they were going to need to ensure that publicly purchased goods and acquired goods were also put towards like a public good. So they ensured that there was like a disposal apparatus that, reversed the flow of bed frames, for instance, from military bases. And then they wind up with universities and dorm rooms and things like that. And hospital equipment gets medical supplies. And so they ensured that there was like a strategic element to disposal as well that suited the public good as much as it did corporate profit. And then at the end of the day, it's a system of reverse logistics. It's like the first time that our government kind of experienced or worked with a reverse logistics system. And so there are important lessons for dealing with like the end of fossil fuel, for instance, right? We need to plan out, well, what are we going to do with all these surplus cars that are going to be on the roads when everybody has electric vehicles, right? What are we going to do with the gas stations? Like all of that infrastructure that exists, right? We have to plan for that obsolescence. So as a contemporary lesson for today, there's a lot to learn. And it's something that we're already used to doing, at least here in Ontario, where, we return our empty beer bottles to the beer store for reuse, right? That's probably the best example I can offer of reverse logistics in action, where you bring something back to the point of production from the point of consumption. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of connecting it too. And I mean, I know we have some American viewers. There's some states that do that with like aluminum, with pop or soda, as they call it. Same sort of system, right? Bring it back. It's the same idea, and I think that's really interesting. And kind of taking it back to what you were talking about at the beginning, the warriors themselves. what's always kind of struck me as interesting and something that is easier maybe to understand nowadays, because this was my grandparents lived through this war, and they always talked about recycling all this stuff. Like my grandfather was pretty good at drawing, and he drew all kinds of stuff about, he literally drew, I wish I had it. He drew a picture of a bunch of like pots and pans, like with legs and arms and legs walking into a factory and then planes flying out of it. I thought that was pretty cool. But
That's
it's
amazing.
Just, I know it was an amazing photo. I wish I had kept it. I was pretty young when I saw it, but yeah, it was amazing. But it just, that sticks in my head, right? This whole idea of recycling. But what you mentioned is that kind of goes on the wayside real quick. That's not really the point of your book, but it is something to think about in the sense this is how you're trying to tie it into contemporary terms.
There's a book that needs to be written about mobilization and reducing, reusing, and recycling for sure. There's like my book, it deals with disposal. It deals with the war's like won. We've already done what we need to do, and now what? Whereas there's definitely a sort of mobilization angle. So something that would be the sort of reverse of what I was talking about, where you take like a military asset, find a civilian purpose for it. Well, I'm willing to bet that at least at the beginning of the war, there's a lot of civilian assets that get militarized. So fishing vessels, for instance, becoming patrol vessels and things like that. So I think that there'd be a really interesting discussion about like the melding of material culture there in an effort to prosecute the war. So
yeah, like a companion piece to what you've looked at and going, like you said, the other way. But I mean, it's just because it gets me thinking about those things of recycling and the war, kind of mindsets of pulling together. And then, like you said, the war is over, and I've been putting this on Twitter. Like, what do you do with all this stuff? Right? There's so much stuff, and I mean, the stories and the anecdotes you found in the book. To me, I mean, we were talking about a little about them. A few of them are pretty funny. There's one I don't want to give it away because I think it's funny in itself. But you got to read it. It's at the end. I don't want to say anything because it's not entirely appropriate. I mean, it's funny. It's just anyway. But the whole idea of where you start the book, right? Talking about and the naval stuff is a big part of this. That and the from the Air Force, the RCAF is these. You talk about these. The need to set I forget, like it's what the naval equivalent, because I was just reading the Air Force part, but the boneyards for the planes, and then the docks for bringing in all the ships that are no longer needed. Like that's I think that's really powerful image that you start with. These crews who, these boats had kept them alive and were helping them fight this war. Now they're literally taking them in, and they have to, at some places, like they have to take stuff out of it. They are the ones that starts the process of pulling them apart, right? Very small way, and then this just kind of keeps going. To me, that's just a really powerful image about Canada's end of Canada's war, because like you talked about how there was an issue with an economic downturn at the end of the First World War, years of that happening after the Second, and also you talk about, and I think this is an important part of your book that's a bit of an aside, but there's that element to it. After the Second World War, there's no like economic downturn by any means, but you do talk about that a little bit. There is a bit of one because it takes some time to kind of get these changes going. I mean, maybe because we have the American perceptions, right? Where I've read multiple times, right? They're making machine guns on one line and they're making refrigerators on the next. In the way you write it about Canada, that's not happening.
No.
You talk about how there's this peak of, I think it's 1943, early 43. And then that's where these kind of questions about what are we going to do? And you use, I think it was the example of, was it cotton? No, not cotton, wool, and all the different uniforms and what that's going to mean. I wonder if you could talk, because that again, that's another example that really stuck in my head. You were talking about that a bit, but I wonder if you could kind of talk about that area a little bit more and kind of what part that sort of played in all of this.
Yeah, so the wool example there is a really useful entry point for a lot of discussions, because you need wool to make officer uniforms, and you need to make sure that you have a consistent amount of wool in the production apparatus, right? Because you can't have a shortage where your workers aren't doing anything, right? Because you don't have the goods. So what happened was at the beginning of the war, there was a push for allowing private companies to like acquire the goods that they needed, and that the government would only do that if necessary or in like critical areas.
Mm.
And then as the war effort gets more, wider, more officers are commissioned, troops start going into combat, more uniforms are being used up. There's like the expansion of the military industrial complex demands more controls from the government. And so when it comes to officer uniforms, they needed to make sure that there were no shortages. And so it became a situation where the government started to have to accumulate a supply of wool ahead of production, right? To ensure that there was always going to be something. And they were doing that in the airplane manufacturing, right? They were acquiring goods like 6 months ahead of using them, right? They were making sure that there was always a steady amount of supply in order to ensure that munitions production would be expedited to the most profitable extent. And then, of course, the question then becomes, once we land in Italy and the Italians surrender, it's like, oh, the war is going to end shortly, right? And so the sudden fear of businesses who are thinking back to the end of the First World War is like, hold on, what are you going to do about the stocks of uniform material that we've acquired? Like, it's going to be useless, and we've paid all this money for it at the end of the war. It's not going to be profitable. And second of all, what are you government officials going to do with all of those assets that you've been acquiring? Where are they going to be liquidated?
Right.
And it became this sort of like questions. The starting point for a lot of these things is they're realizing the complexity of disposal, that the government officials start to like, they're getting all of this like inputs from a variety of different areas, like different companies and different people are telling them virtually the same thing. And they kind of like, it dawns on, I think it's Donald Gordon, who realizes, the guy who's in charge of the Wartime Prices and Trade Board, it kind of dawns on him that they're going to have to figure out some type of control for disposal, or else like a glorious state of confusion, I think was the term he used, would occur. And so that's the sort of like emphasis towards starting to deal with the issue. And wool was just like one thing,
right?
And it was probably the one that I had best documented in terms of the discussion and in terms of the interdepartmental nature of it. But this happened with everything from like rubber tires to razor blades to belt buckles and bombs and bullets. Like it happened across every piece of good that had been acquired for the war effort. There was a question, okay, what now?
Yeah, and that's kind of one question I did want to ask, because you mentioned that in the book. I mean, I was just about to say, like, also the example of aluminum is huge, especially in Canada, right? Because Canada is one of the producers. I think Canada was the largest producer of aluminum during the war.
One of them, yeah.
Yeah, if not, one of the top for sure. But anyway, so because it's used in airplanes, for those who don't know, and all that kind of stuff. But to me, that just because that came up again too. There's these different factors, different people, private businesses, pushing for this, worries about, over flooding the market again, like you already mentioned. So, but that led me to another kind of question I had. And I want to qualify this, because you say in your book, which I'm not saying it's not expertly sourced, because it definitely is. The issues you kind of had though was finding, how do I say this, like down to like the nitty gritty, small levels. You talk about one part, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but one factory that was really, really well documented what they did with it. So that kind of leads me to, it's kind of like a two-part question. So why do you think that there's such little documentation? Do you think that was because all of this was kind of slapdash? And maybe then we'll ask that after another one after. But I think that to me just sticks out again, right? That you have all this information and all these letters, because again, I know the archives, I know some of the figures you're writing about and what's available and all that. But then when you get down to these, because again, you hear these stories, there's factories everywhere, there's places making stuff all over the country. But then you're like, oh yeah, we don't know too much about, other than this one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so that's actually a really perceptive question to ask.
Well, I do my best.
Like what happens to these documents? No, it's really, because that was something that really bothered me. It's like, where did all the documents go?
Yeah.
Like the War Assets Corporation, like their documents talk about how much paperwork they were dealing
Yeah.
with, and all of these like regional offices and all these other types of things. None of that exists at the Library and Archives Canada, right? It's likely in 1950 when the organization was fundamentally reshaped. So the War Assets Corporation is
Right.
the sort of like body, the government body that I looked at, and they are fundamentally sort of like appropriated and revised, and they go from like 9,000 employees in 47 to 200 in 1950.
Mhm.
So the sort of like permanent state disposal apparatus is established. Well, I'm convinced that at some point in time there, they moved to a smaller building. They didn't have the space for the
Yeah.
records, and the records were disposed of because they weren't deemed to be useful. Like all the receipts from every sale.
Yeah.
It was like 5 years later, what do you need that information for anymore? So at some point in time, they got their record collection. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean there isn't any records there. The RG
Right.
101 is really useful at LAC. It contains a lot of information all the way up to 1985. And there's a lot of little interesting stories that are waiting to be told in that record group. But it's a shell of what it should be,
Mhm.
unfortunately. And then the other end of that is that the departments also had to develop disposal administrations because they had to relinquish assets to the War Assets Corporation. So there's like a sort of like duplicate disposal administration inside every department that develops. So there are records inside like the Munitions and Supply, Department of Defense. All these organizations have records about disposal. So if you look at like the shell of the War Assets Corporation, you can fill it with some of the information from these other
Mm.
government departments, which is what I ended up having to do. Is a lot of extra work, I might add,
Yeah.
but it's still a lot of documents that are there. And the interesting story that something that I've always wanted to track down. So at the end of the war, Munitions and Supply is really concerned about what are they going to do with all this stuff? Like, how are we going to like keep the economy strong? What are we going to plan? Right. This is like essentially the economic heartbeat of the country is
Mhm.
flowing through Munitions and Supply.
Yeah.
And so they took that job very seriously. And so what they decided to do was set up a committee. It's called the Post Termination Crown Owned Plants Committee. It's a terrible
Yeah.
name, a clunky name, but it is so important because this is the committee that was given like 3 or 4 jobs. I believe that the chair of the committee at one point was H.R. Malley, who's a figure I talk about in my
Mm.
book at times. But it was also F.M. Brown, who was one of C.D. Howe's like key of accountants. He was sort of like his trouble, like the trouble master. If there's a problem, he
Yeah.
sent Brown after it. So these guys get set up, and their job was to figure out how to fire everybody, right?
Mm.
Because the government's not going to need any munitions production, at
Right.
least on the scale of the war in the peacetime. So how are we going to fire everybody in one go or progressively? What are we going to do with all the crown plants? Right? All the stuff, because not a lot of people realize that it's actually public enterprise that wins the war, right? The government buys what's needed, and they couldn't rely on corporations to do what was necessary, right? No gut company wanted to invest in something that had no prospects of survival in the post-war period. So no one wanted to make ammunition and fill it,
Right.
right? For example, the government had to do that. So again, another interesting lesson for dealing with climate change nowadays, if you're curious, is that the government could set up a crown company to make charging stations and everything. Anyway, beside the point. The point here is that this committee has to decide what to do with all these materials, and then the
Mm.
last thing, what do you do with all the records? That was what they were set up to deal with. This committee made the decision to eliminate the duplicates.
Mm.
And they were sitting in Ottawa and assumed that Ottawa had all of the duplicates, copies of everything to begin with.
Yeah.
And so when factories were, and I've seen the correspondence, the factories are sending messages to this plant saying like, listen, I have 99 filing cabinets, 3 drawers full. This is Canadian Propellers Limited. I remember
Oh.
this because Canadian Propellers Limited. I'm okay, 99 filing cabinets. Wow. I'm going to Google Canadian propellers. I looked on in the Quebec archives. I looked in the Montreal City archives. I looked in archives of Ontario, LAC. Nowhere has any funds for Canadian Propellers Limited. And the information that they were getting back, the correspondent said, well, just eliminate the duplicates. And now we have 99 missing filing cabinets worth of information. And so this situation accounts for why there's so few documents. At one point in time, Munitions and Supply was considering taking, I think it was 1,000 square foot facility and piling boxes floor to ceiling in it. And that was going to be its archive. It was going to be in Cornwall. That's where they were going to set it up. But it was too impractical. They weren't going to have the budget for it.
Right.
So again, so you're looking at a lot of these documents going up in smoke as a result, because a variety of competing factors and a whole bunch of other things that we can't really always get into, but that's why documents don't exist.
Yeah, and that's because and you basically answered my second part of that question, is just what it was like for you, but that you did a great job answering that, because again, historian myself, the battle I did is documented, but also not, if you know what I mean. Like, there's no official documents until they're made later, etc. I get the frustration, but it also leads to me kind of the second area I wanted to talk about here is you do a really good job of explaining literally what this looks like in certain instances, like the nuts and bolts of it, if you will. I guess I can make a manufacturing joke there. But you talk about the one, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's talking about literally what this process looked like. It was a factory outside Montreal. It was in Quebec somewhere. I can't remember where. Anyway, I was just wondering, you can just talk about it generally, but that leads to, maybe we can get into this, but I would like you just to explain for the viewers, say like that example, it was a factory and they were done with it.
Yeah.
What next? Yeah.
So a whole series of interesting sort of like layers to discussion. It wasn't just like, okay, the war's over, let's go home. There was a sort of like a strategic plan. So some factories were deemed to be too important to privatize. So that's what they decide to do to sort of maintain a domestic munitions production facility. So sort of like a permanent military industrial complex, if you will. And then there are other ones that they say, okay, these are no longer needed, so we're going to get rid of these materials. And so what happens in that type of situation would be the private contractor would go through and sort of determine what they wanted to keep and what they didn't. The government would go through with its sort of like the Department of Munitions and Supply, sort of like investigators would go through and say, okay, well, the government may need this for our post-war apparatus and other stuff like that, but everything else we need to get rid of. And then a third layer of inspectors would come in from the war assets and then value the stuff differently.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, like it might not be related to a factory, but one of the more interesting case studies were like surplus radios. So the Air Force said, well, these radios are useless. They're not top of the line. They're surplus. They're obsolete. Let's take them apart. Let's destroy them. Right. But the War Assets Corporation came in and valued these differently because they knew that hobbyists liked the broken machines because that meant that they could fix them. Right. They like the technical engagement. So the civilian market had slightly different expectations for what was useful and what wasn't. And the War Assets Corporation was trying to cater to that more than the government departments, which were just sitting there saying like, yeah, that machine tool is useless. This is useless. We need to keep all of these right. Like they had different sort of like I call them value regimes where they were like defining a hierarchy of worth to the asset. And so once that process was done inside a factory, the assets were removed that needed to be kept. And then the War Assets Corporation would move in only after the private contractor and the decontamination specialist would move in, and they would start to like area burn, where explosive compounds were. They would, desensitize equipment. They would do whatever they could to make sure that these places were safe. Which meant a lot of cleaning, a lot of, issues involving toxicity and hazardous materials, which, is sort of the new project that I've been actually working a lot on is about the sort of like expertise and toxicity involving munitions production. Okay. That's where I've been actually focused a little bit more. But at the end of the day, once these things were desensitized, they were then sent to the War Assets Corporation, which would then make the sale. They were the sort of like the government sales agent, and then they would, usually only deal with a business. You had to be like an established business or have some type of business credential to get access to this, because they didn't want to sell to speculators who could then undercut prices and things like that.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's leading to kind of where I wanted to ask about next, and I think it's an unavoidable part here, is because you talked about it real brief there, but what that cleaning up, because you go into more detail in the book, which I haven't said this yet, but do buy the book. There's links below. Again, full disclosure, they help me out. I get a little bit of something from it. If you can, please do. But again, like I say, for most of these books, get it however you can, because it's a good one. And it just explores in this kind of way we're talking about, like a case study kind of basis, which to me is fascinating. But anyway, getting back to my question here is talking about the decontaminating and the process.
Yeah.
It's kind of mind-blowing in today's world. I mean, even things like this still go on to, but you mentioned it real brief there, like, because that's the example, the one in Quebec, talking about like to just burn it down. They just burn parts, and that takes care of the problem. You said you're working on this coming up, so maybe I don't want to tell if you want to talk about the secret. That's cool. I just because there's another part I do want to get to, stuff about like dumping in the oceans, but I want to get to there after this. But these environmental concerns, I don't even know how to say this. Like, I'm just like, that's not taking care of anything. And then because you describe it, right? They're literally burning. I think it was an ammunitions factory, but they're making cordite, I think, and they're just burning everything. And then they, dig up the dirt, and then they take that to the dump. I went, that's not gonna do much good. But maybe if you got more into that, or I missed something, I don't know. Hopefully you can kind of put our minds at ease a little bit. Or if not, that's fine too. I mean,
I can't say that I'll put people's minds at ease, unfortunately. But I guess the key entry point, especially for somebody that might not be familiar or to sort of like wrap your head around this big subject, is to realize that what we consider as safe is historically contingent. And it's constantly changing based upon like new substances and new technologies that are developed. That there's always this lag behind with science telling us like what is right and what is safe, what is dangerous, right? That there's always this sort of like lag in expertise. And where that comes into play is when there's like inconclusive findings, or right. A lot of the time scientists don't think that inconclusive findings have significance, but it does, in the sense that it allows like political and economic stakeholders to step in and argue that they're actually right. And so when you don't have something definitive telling you to do something, then the governments they can not manipulate, but they can argue the alternative. Oh, it's something else that's killing the fish, or it's something else that the science hasn't detected yet, right? So in this context, you have to understand that the TNT, it comes into full-scale production in the early 1900s. It was brand spanking new in the First World War, which is why you're dealing with so many issues of TNT poisoning among workers during the First World War. And in the Second World War, they knew more, so they're better controls for TNT poisoning and other things like that. So they knew that this stuff was toxic and that they would have to do something about it, but never had they dealt with something on that scale. And the methods that they had used to like clean up were sort of like the equivalent of sweeping the dirt under the rug, right? Or like they thought that they had handled the situation as much as they could, but like, over the issue, like over time, new technologies are developed, right? About like blast chambers and incineration furnaces that have much better filtration technologies, and all that sort of stuff. All of that's like a product of détente and nuclear weapons disarmament and all that sort of stuff. They had to develop sophisticated filtration systems for dealing with that, right? So we're looking back at that time through that sort of lens, where it's like, the toxicity should have been known, but they didn't really appreciate the slow violence, the longevity of these
Right.
issues when they would clear a field, like in the proof yard, right, where they would proof test a batch of artillery shells. And early in the war, there were a lot of duds because our workers had no experience making shells, and shells are very sophisticated technology system. And so those shells would burrow into the ground, and they might not even be visible to a technician 5 years later tasked with cleaning the place up, right? Let alone the particles that are, in the dust and in the dirt. You burn the thing and it's like, okay, we're good, but it doesn't take into the consideration the fact that the contamination has migrated since it was first introduced. One of the better factories that I've had access to some of the records to, I can't really name the factory offhand, but they had a pollution study done. And this particular factory found that the particles of lead were like 15 times the acceptable threshold when they were releasing it into the nearby river. Yeah. And that's why all munitions plants are located near rivers or located near lakes. They need a massive amount of water, not only for safety, but also for production effluent. Because when you're making TNT and other types of explosives, you need water. Water is an essential ingredient in that production. And so you're looking at a lot of contamination getting dispersed into the environment as a result.
Yeah, and that's another one that kind of stuck with me from the book is, and I think I wasn't thinking in that sense. And this is the thing that historians do for us, right? Put these things into context. But it was, again, the same sort of idea about, it was a bunch of them, and they were talking about how one lake was really contaminated and the local people knew about it, but like the department didn't really know about it. But then there was another one where they dug a bunch of drainage ditches, and then to solve the problem, again, like you're right, perceptions change. But also another point I want to make in a second is, but they just said, okay, we'll flush the ditches and it'll be okay. That's just causing more problems. And I think this is an important point that really comes through in your book is, yes, they're thinking about these issues and they're taking into account so many different things. But something I think you do a really good job of is the thread across this is it's a little bit ad hoc the whole time. There's diminishing budgets. There's less, like you said, there's less people to deal with this. You talked about how literally the numbers in the military of the different branches, right? They're decreasing as the war ends. They want to get these people back home. They want to, well, for budget reasons, they want them gone. They don't want to pay for them anymore. So who does this work, right? There's no one to do it. And to me, that is something that is going to stick with me and change my perceptions about the immediate post-war period. Because you always hear about this affluence and the economy is booming and there's no problems with anything. You can get whatever you need and anyone. There's tons of workers. Everyone's got work. Everyone's all good. Yeah. This is painting a different picture. This is painting a picture of there's problems, there's less people, there's less budgets, all this stuff. And then stuff falls through the cracks almost sometimes literally in some of the cases you talk about. But like things like records and processes not even being followed properly. Like that one stuck out to me, right? Being like, oh, who's going to check? Who cares, right? We're just getting rid of it. We need to do this. We don't have a choice. Like to me, that really stuck out. And again, that has a huge impact on what's left. Right? Because as we know, we find this all the time that this is still happening. And it's not even just from war production, it's from other production, the issues. So, and I did want to talk about this because we talked about this before is, and I think it's an important part of your book. And I think it's something that's going to cause some real problems very soon is underwater dumping. That is a big one because that's going to have impacts on all kinds of people and not just Canadians, right? This is, and I wonder if you can just kind of explain a little bit more about all of that because it's quite complicated. I know it sounds simplistic, but it's not. Again, I'm not telling you that, you know that, but the audience, right? You just hear, oh, they threw shells in the ocean. What's the big deal?
Yeah. So there's a huge issue following the war involving explosives, ammunition, chemical weapons, right? These are really dangerous commodity chains that were all associated with conflict, and they had to be disposed of in a responsible way. right? You couldn't just necessarily sell a whole bunch of bombs and explosives to anybody on the street corner. You couldn't, sell a tank, for instance, to Jim Smith or whatever on the street corner, right? There had to be restrictions on these things. So when the war is over and the governments don't need the amount of bullets, they don't need these explosives on the scale that they're having. There's a huge logistical issue. You factor in all the stuff that's overseas, in transit, half finished, all the raw production inputs, and then the captured enemy ordnance, right? Which is a really big problem, right? Especially in Japan, where the war ends with atomic weapons being used, not an invasion. And so the Japanese had been waiting, and they had stockpiles. And so when the occupation forces show up, the first order of business is we need to get rid of these assets as quickly as possible because there might be an armed rising against us. And so the Americans are dumping as a result, because it was the quickest way to get rid of assets, about 5,000 tons a day in November of 1945. And the British and Americans are doing the same thing throughout Europe. As a way of disposing of dangerous assets in what they considered to be a responsible way, because once it was underwater, you couldn't get it, right? That was the responsible thing. It was responsible to put them on the seabed rather than put them in some warehouse that taxpayers would have to pay for, right? So it was like a cheap way of getting rid of it, in the sense that you didn't have to build blast furnaces. You didn't have to build a huge infrastructure to then just tear it down once you finish destroying everything. Right. That mentality comes later in the 20th century. At that time, they are dealing with a logistical headache. They're dealing with uncertainty involving the enemy, and they need to get rid of these assets as quickly as possible. And the science is telling them that it's okay, right? That the water will disperse the pollution, right? They knew that this was toxic, but the water would be the solution for our disposal issues. So the scientists are acting as a bit of an enabler here, because there's a lot of inconclusive results about TNT in marine environments. There's a lot of inconclusive results about what mustard gas does in the ocean when you've thrown it overboard. There's a really big assumption that's made about the dilution process. And there's also an assumption that the government is actually putting the stuff where it's supposed to be, but that's not always the case, because navigation isn't very good. Right? The ships can get lost. They also start dumping as soon as they leave the port, because it's a really labor-intensive process. So it takes a long time for them to get rid of assets. So an early start was better. You didn't have to pay overtime wages. So in that sense, you're looking at a lot of things that conspire to put munitions in the water and then put them everywhere in the water. And these are really big issues, because the science is starting to catch up, and they're starting to find that, like, the concentrations are more sublethal in terms of their impact on the environments. They're not necessarily going to kill the fish, but they're going to damage them enough that maybe we don't want to eat them. Or maybe that there's some other issue that's related as a result. So there's some really big issues about health concerns, but the science is still not conclusive, because there's so much pollution in the oceans. It's really difficult to determine an individual marker that's specific to munitions. Like ammonium nitrate, for instance, is used in a lot of explosives at the time. And that is an ammonium nitrate that's indistinguishable from the type of fertilizer that you would like run off a field and then ends up in the water table as a result. So like agricultural runoff or munitions, it's kind of like hard to differentiate a particular input. But that being said, like your story about finding a grenade, right? It happens all the time. My Twitter feed and my LinkedIn page and other stuff are constantly showing me the bomb squads are constantly being called out, especially in Britain. There's munitions that are washing up on shore everywhere, and they're a legitimate hazard for people, right? That can kill you, right? They can set off, waterlogged explosives can destabilize. The corrosion in some of these materials, they might be armed for all we know, right? So there's a really big, serious concern for like safety at the beach. But then there's also concern for like construction projects, So a lot of wind farms are being constructed offshore in Europe, and they're going out and they're finding, oh crap, it's a huge dump site. Like, what are we going to do? Like, this is the one spot where we can put the windmill where it's perfect wind, right? And there's no disruption to fish, and there's no this.
Yeah.
And well, that was the number one criteria essentially for putting the stuff in the ocean is that it wasn't going to disrupt trade routes and fishing and other things like that. And so now you're looking at a lot of problems that are a result of underwater munitions. And so it's starting to become a real issue. There's a lot of talk about how are we going to clean them up and when and why. I'm involved in an organization that is actually working on doing that, the International Dialogue on Underwater Munitions. And so that there's a sort of push to create a collective action, because there's new research saying that as the oceans warm and get more acidic, the munitions are going to corrode faster, which means that there'll be a potential for a greater release or more damaging issues as a result. So there's definitely some, ongoing concerns, present day concerns related to this historical issue. And so I like to think that my research has some is cutting edge in the sense that it bridges the past and present really well.
Yeah, and then that's why I wanted to talk about this, because I think it is it is a bridge. And I mean, I wanted to cut you off, not in a rude way, because I want to make a point, but you were doing so good, I didn't want to stop it. But you talked about dumping mustard gas, right? That's something and this is a bit of an aside here, but you don't think about that for the Second World War. That's First World War, where they didn't use gas. In the Second World War in combat.
That's a very huge mistake to say that. The Second World War is the largest gas war ever, if we're just looking at stockpiles.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is that there's huge stockpiles. Like every country has them. They're just not using them in, there's stories, but not in big numbers, not like the First World War. But anyway, but you'll still have to get rid of it, right? And you talk about that, right? You didn't talk about the German stockpiles of mustard gas, and that the Americans have to get rid of it. And that's kind of, like you said, this is where this sort of starts. So again, that's just something to think about. But that also leads to my other thoughts. Like you already mentioned, stuff washes up on shore. I mean, those of you who are interested in the First World War probably hear about the iron harvests in Belgium and France. So that's a big problem there. It's happening. It's going to go on for hundreds of years. So are the estimates, and I believe it because I've seen it myself so much. And it's not even on purpose, right? This stuff just comes up on its own. But with the Second World War, with all this dumping, I think it's going to be a huge problem. And I honestly don't know how they're going to deal with this. I mean, you've been doing work in this. I know that. And it's one of those things I don't know. I haven't done any work in this, so I can't wrap my head around it. But it's just, like you said, there's this, your work is cutting edge because, and people always, joke, oh, sometimes history doesn't matter. Well, this definitely matters. I mean, it's going to have a huge impact. So I think your work is a good thing in bringing that. So maybe I'll have you back on another time to talk about maybe that or the other work you're doing. Because I did want to ask about what you think, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but where this area of study is going. Is it getting more attention? Is it getting the right attention? Again, I don't know this too well because I don't do the material stuff or the environmental stuff like you do. But are there questions being asked that are like really piquing your interest? Really, I don't know. Where do you see next coming? I guess is what I'm asking you here.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of recent scholarship that's going into the environment and warfare. I think it's really blowing up. To make a terrible pun, there's been a lot of really interesting work. And there's also a lot of integration in that field with the global South. And I don't think a lot of people realize just how much the global North relied on the resources and materials that are coming out of the South, right? Matthew Evedin's work on aluminum commodity chains is a really good entry point for that, where the bauxite that makes all of the fuselages comes from I think it's British Guyana, mines in British Guyana, right? And you're looking at forests being clear cut across Africa and the South, in the South of America and other things like that, where these resources are being inputted into the production, right? And they're being consumed for the war purposes. And so there's a lot of like really interesting studies that are working on the sort of like global connections and the sort of transnational elements that are involved in that. So I think that that's where a lot of interest is coming in, and I think a lot of interest is coming in food as well.
Right.
That food is a vehicle for understanding the war. That to me has been a really big growth area. And I think inversely too, and I hope that some of my study will look at is water, water resources and war and conflict and pollution and things like that. I hope that that's where the sort of like history gets like can expand more.
Right.
So I think that's more or less where my current research is. I'm looking a lot at like water and pollution and the sort of like the military's role in causing a lot of stuff. I've published a handful of articles in the last little bit about underwater munitions, and I'm working my way through sources and things like that on Canada's military industrial complex. I'm working on an edited collection right now with Matthew Wiseman about the historical perspectives on it.
Cool.
And so we're hopeful to have that submitted for peer review as quickly as possible. And some of my work in that is on munitions production and the pollution of factories. And so I think that there's a lot of material that needs to be discussed. And I guess you got me thinking about like areas and where we need to know more. And honestly, I think we need to know more about the science. The sort of history of science in Canada. And I know that there's a lot of really good books that are being done on it, but like how is it mobilized for war and like what are the sort of like, like the limitations of the experts? Like where does the sort of like limits of their understanding of toxicity, for instance, factor in and questions about like the sort of like blind spots that exist in the expertise, I think is a needed study in Canada and something that I think and certainly Matt Wiseman's work demonstrates is that there's this like long projection of these experts. They have careers that span a number of decades, so they're around for a while. So I think we need to understand those things a little bit better.
Yeah, and I mean, again, not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but I guess the thing I should say is that's exciting to hear that this is an area that's going to get explored. I mean, I completely agree with you. Things like Global South, water is huge.
Yeah,
I think it's not understood at all. I mean, to me, it's fascinating. Food is fascinating. Those are like, I mean, I just call myself a history nerd because it's just true. But those are some areas that I would like to know more. It's just there is work being done. Just it's not it's prevalent yet. I'm sure there's journal articles, but I don't have the time to find them. But anyway, so
I barely have time.
Yeah, I mean, none of us do. But you know what I mean? It's just it's an interest, and this is all connected, right? Because it's connected to environmental history. You're doing that cross work that is so difficult to do, and so kudos to you for that. To kind of the last question, we were talking about this before. You mentioned it in the book. This is not your focus, but I'm going to ask about it because I can't not. So you talk about how this book is not about the stuff that makes it into collections, museums, private collections, private collectors. That's not what this book is about, and it's not. I just wanted to get your thoughts on kind of what that means, because we when I first put this out on Twitter, somebody asked or made a comment about they should have just kept the Spitfires or something and then sold them off one by one every once in a while so everyone can kind of get a shot at it. You go, well, that's not a good idea. You said, because that's going to hurt the post-war economy in a way, or production. And I'm just wondering, do you think that sort of line was walked well? Did they do it improperly? Like, should there be more? I mean, again, I'm just kind of putting you on the spot, but you did mention you did a lot of public history. So I think this is a fair question. Is that okay? Like, do we have enough to understand what was from the war? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm asking this probably the best way, but
I think that they did a really good job. Personally, I know that saying that there were problems and government officials didn't get things right in some cases, but I think overall they did what they were intended to do. I think that they did a good job. They ensured that the wastes of war were put to as many productive uses as possible. Now, exactly what was productive and what wasn't, there were different sort of scales, different discussions, and there was a lot of politics involved that
Right.
sometimes got in the way and sometimes it didn't. So I think that there's certainly an avenue for arguing that there's like a mixed success at the very least. But from my point of view, that there was a lot of like sort of like an intended outcome that, at least in the documents, seemed to happen right as intended. That they created a system to monitor disposal and to ensure that there was no bottom falling out of the economy. Right, that was their biggest concern. It wasn't about like ensuring prosperity. It was about ensuring that the bottom wouldn't fall out. And then once that bottom was established, once you tore down all the munitions factories, you had to make sure that that lumber ended up in a productive place building houses in the post-war period. So that in a structural sense, they're very successful. In a case-by-case basis, you could probably make some argument that they didn't do a good job here or there, but overall, it's very difficult to argue that they were bad. There are some countries that have bad disposal at the end of the war, but for the most part, it's in Canada they do a really, really, really good job, and that is, I think, part of the reason why there are so few material legacies left over, right? As you pointed out, it's like a lot of material culture enthusiasts who pay attention to my work and have talked to me about it. They cringe when they hear me talk about these like fields of planes getting taken apart like the Thanksgiving turkey.
Yeah, what was the term? I think what did they call it when they literally chop planes into pieces?
Guillotine.
It was a guillotine. Yeah,
they just guillotine them. They get a heavy metal slab and they just chop up the plane, and so they can reuse the metal.
Yeah.
Right. And so when people started like talking about, oh, what a waste, my perspective is no, leaving them as a plane, as an entity, like an object of a network of objects working together as a plane was actually not productive. Like leaving it, right? That was the wasteful option. The most productive option was actually to take it apart and then reuse the engine for something else, and the plane, melt the metal down to build community hockey rinks and things like that occurs quite frequently after the war. And so this idea of making sure that these material assets are being deployed as effectively as possible, the government's actually quite successful. And that, of course, doesn't endear me to the material culture specialists who want more of these assets. And I completely understand. I would love to see more of these things on a daily basis. I mean, who wouldn't want to drive a Sherman to work in the morning? But the point is that maintaining these things in the post-war period was going to cost too much, and you had to make sure that they went to as most productive outcome as possible. And the state is relatively successful at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I mean, before going to the book, I didn't have same sort of, not that sort of perception of like, oh yeah, it's a waste. I didn't necessarily think about it that way, because I knew there was a lot of recycling and things going on and what was being done with all this different stuff, depending on what it was. But I don't know, maybe it's just the military historian in me. I just hear like those pictures of the Lancasters getting ripped to pieces. I'm just like, that hurts a little, you know what I mean? There's so few of them left now, and it's just like, and they're just such a cool machine. I'm sure those people who know my Twitter feed and my YouTube channel know I love the Lancaster. So it's just like, it hurts a little, but I'm like, yeah, it needed to be done. I get it. And Alex is telling me that it's definitely needed to be done.
Anyway, so I'm sorry. But it's either we keep these nice factory buildings and no one has any homes. Or like we keep these nice planes and no one has metal to like build other things with. Then
you're right. When you're right. I mean, it's just one of those things. It's like, I know there's nothing I can do, but it just still hurts a little. But
if anything, this project really taught me just how important being thrifty is, right? And like the generation that like survived the Great Depression and win the war, they're really resourceful. They're really thrifty. I think I used the term they MacGyvered their post-war success, because at the end of the day, there are huge shortages as like the economy is transitioning into peacetime. They had to make do with what they could acquire, and what they could acquire was stuff that was already produced, and it was through the government disposal organization. So they had to like make do and get thrifty and adapt something that wasn't necessarily purpose built for their needs.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I should have said this earlier, but I just mentioned the books in the pictures of the book with the Lancasters, but there's some striking ones of old planes that were used in the Commonwealth Training Plan,
Yeah.
just sitting in farm fields surrounded by cows. Because when you think about it in that way, yeah, these planes are like a gold mine full of, even the wiring alone, I can think about because I had relatives back then who were farmers. Like just stuff like that is a gold mine because these things are huge and they're full of so much stuff.
Yeah.
And there are parts you could use for tractors and tires and all this stuff. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point to kind of wrap up here is this thriftiness, this sort of trade-off with the material culture, but also the people after the war. And we didn't really talk about this, but Canada has a housing crisis during the war and after, especially. That's why every Canadian city is full of those tiny little houses.
That's why there are riots in Halifax.
Yeah, I mean, there's shortage issues. I mean, Quebec has a major issue with having nowhere to live. It happens in parts of Ontario as well. I mean, it's something we didn't really
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar. Is history repeating itself?
Needs to do that, doesn't it? But I mean, it's just all this stuff is connected, and this is why I thought the book was so interesting because I love stuff that looks at a more known problem or something that's been done, but then you're like, it flips your perceptions, and I think your book does a really good job with that.
Well, thank you very much.
And I really enjoyed it. I think it's an important work, and I think any Canadian historian or any military should read your book because for me, it answered a lot of questions and raised some good ones, which is what our work's supposed to do, right? So it was really enjoyable to read. So I'm just going to sign off, and I'll come back and say bye to you. All right, Alex?
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
So thanks, everyone, for watching. This was a really great discussion. Alex clearly knows what he's talking about. Wrote a really interesting book. Again, check it out in the links below. Also, please subscribe to the channel. I know I keep saying that, but I really do need your help. Please subscribe if you haven't already and you're watching this. Every subscriber helps me grow the channel. If you can provide some support through Patreon, you get some benefits to like behind the scenes stuff, early access, and I'm starting to do a lot more with digital downloads with patrons. And also, if you just want to make a one-time contribution with Buy Me a Coffee, that would be hugely appreciated because without that, I can't keep doing this stuff. So any help you can give. So coming up next in 2 days' time on Thursday night as well, I have Kyle Falcon coming on, who did his work on having trouble describing it, but spiritualism, I don't know, ghost stories. It's a really interesting stuff. Perfect for October and the Halloween season. It's the same time, 7 p.m. So come check it out. Kyle knows what he's talking about. I saw his presentation a couple of years ago, and I'm just mind blown by the things he discovered. So come watch that one. It's going to be a good one and perfect for the Halloween season. So we'll see everybody on then. So thanks again, Alex. Did you like coming on the show? Did you didn't ask you too many tough questions, did I?
No, it was fine. I enjoyed it tremendously.
All right. So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you coming on and giving up part of your evening for us. So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks again, Alex, for coming on, and I'll see you 2 days' time.